Do you need us to load it, Damon?
We are live.
Okay.
We're live now. Are we able to get my presentation up now, or?
Yes, we are live. Good morning, everyone. We're having one little technical difficulty. Damon, if you email it to me real quick, I can upload it.
Okay.
I know you guys can wing it.
Hello, everybody. This is Hector Bojorquez, Director of Operations at IDRA. Welcome this morning. Everybody is coming on. Dr. Johnson will come on in a second as well. Dr. Damon Holt is right here with us. If you would just bear with us for 1 second and we can start right away. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. And I know some of you may have received some emails from me early this morning, and I really appreciate that. And I've been trying to answer some of those personally. I think I was able to respond to about 50 out of the 100 and so that I sent this morning, last night. But thank you so much. If you would just bear with us for 1 minute.
Thank you.
And I see in the chat, good morning, everybody. From Meridian, Mississippi. We got some folks still from San Antonio from here, Sugarland. Thank you, Mr. Emilio Zamora. Tasha Crockett, thank you so much. And from Dallas, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
All right. Well, as we're getting our presentation together, thank you so kindly. Good morning to everybody. I hope everybody's having a wonderful morning. Thank you so kindly. Forgive us for this slight little delay trying to get the PowerPoint up. But I'm just going to go because I pretty much know all my content by heart. But anyways, good morning to you. My name is Dr. Damon Holt, and I am a certified traumatologist and trauma crisis specialist and mental health specialist. And so today we're going to be coming to you talking about something that's very, very important, especially in the areas of education. And I always say, as a professional and as an expert, to our educators and administrators in the room, until we first address how kids feel, we will always struggle on how kids learn. And a lot of that comes with chronic stress and a lot of trauma that a lot of our students are going through. I believe today that we have to be even more comprehensive and robust in our approach, because of the simple fact that now trauma is a school community issue. So it's no longer just our focus on students, but we also need to figure out how in the world do we support our teachers in the room? What do we do for traumatized teachers and traumatized counselors and social workers and school psychologists who are taking on the symptoms of compassion fatigue, burnout, and STS, known as secondary traumatic stress. Secondary trauma is real. And so for professionals and caregivers and first responders who work with patients, clients, or students that has a lot of chronic stress and trauma, if you're not careful, you can be impacted as well by that same trauma. And so today we're going to be talking about resilience above trauma, because I believe that a lot of times when we hear a lot about trauma, that it's more deficit lens, is more on the negative side, and we don't switch over into more of the asset-based and the strength-based approach to trauma. And so today I'm going to be sharing a lot. So I just have about 30 minutes with you, and then I'm going to get out of your way. But let me tell you something about trauma. I don't care what has happened to the brain. One thing about the most complex organ in our body, which is our brain, is that our brain can heal. Trauma may be your history, but certainly trauma does not have to be your destiny. And it's important that we heal from trauma, Because if I don't heal from my trauma, I'm going to end up bleeding on people that didn't cut me, because hurting people hurt people. So what we're seeing in our educational system is we're seeing a lot of trauma and chronic stress among students, among parents, and among staff. And if we don't shift that culture from stress and from hurt and pain into healing, then we're not going to get the cognition that we need to impact academics. And we're certainly not going to get regulation of so that we can have good behavior. And so what we're seeing is in a lot of our school districts, from all fronts, is that we're seeing low academics and we're seeing behavior all over the place, from aggression, from defiance, or just being disengaged. And so we're going to be talking about these things that's going to be very, very important to us on today. And so today, as we look at the trauma, we must know that trauma is real, and many people are going through trauma like never before. And I believe that trauma in our education system is pretty much like a public health crisis today. And trauma is like the bacteria in the room. And if you have not or will not address trauma, it turns into an infection. And we began to see these symptoms of the infection, such as I alluded to before, low academics, eroding of the classroom management, high discipline, versus instruction, and also disparities among students of color and poor children. And so we have to get to the point where we are really focusing on how to get our issues in regards to chronic stress in place. So thank you for having our slide up. So as we go into our trauma and early childhood trauma, one thing that Frederick Douglass said, he said, it's far easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. This is huge, ladies and gentlemen, because of the fact of the matter is that until we first begin to address childhood trauma, which obviously turns into a lot of our adult issues, we're going to be spinning our wheels. So the better we catch trauma at its earlier stages, the better the outcomes our children is going to have. So I'm a traumatologist, so pretty much it is a specific field in the realm of psychology, and pretty much we are specialists that look at how trauma impacts the brain, how it impacts the nervous system, how it impacts our neurology, psychology, and our physiology. It impacts memory, explicit and illicit memory, all those different things. And so, but the good thing is, though it impacts it, we can heal. So where do we get this from? So in the 1700s, 1800s, we began to see different symptoms of these things, what we call today trauma and post-traumatic stress. We saw that individuals that went to war, our war veterans, would come back and have these different psychological or some type of psychosis of symptoms. Some would have nightmares. Some could not sleep. They'll have insomnia. They would struggle with anxiety and depression. And so they began to have these different names and titles. Some called it in the Civil War, soldier's heart syndrome. In the 1900s, it was called traumatic neurosis. In World War I, it was called shell shock. World War II, we called it combat neurosis and operational fatigue. And so what we saw is that many of the war heroes was coming back showing these different signs. And again, like I said, we saw in the 1900s traumatic neurosis and things like that. It wasn't until 1980 where we got the official diagnosis from the APA, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we know as it to now. Early childhood trauma is real. And so if you've heard of ACE, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, it's pretty much an instrument to assess early childhood trauma on how individuals that suffer from different types of early childhood trauma can and will be impacted if it's not dealt with immediately and expeditiously and professionally. And so again, when I talk about trauma, trauma-informed, you probably heard trauma-informed care, which I do that, but I also do trauma-responsive practices, because I think that's the next level a lot of our districts need, is not just the informed piece, but what does it look like to actually have tools in your toolkit to work with not only just students, ladies and gentlemen, But again, I'm talking about the whole school community. How do we also support our teachers? How we support our certified and our classified staff in regards to chronic stress? So when we look at the new robust approach to trauma, it should be looking something like this, where everything is encompassed, everything is connected, and there's no silo programs and initiatives. It's all connected to dealing with trauma, because until you first deal with the bacteria, you're going to always have these symptoms. And what we've seen is throughout districts throughout the nation is that we grab programs to try to fix behaviors without dealing with the cause. So again, I go back talking about trauma is like the bacteria that now has an infection, and it has all these symptom clusters of bad behavior, low academics, eroding classroom management. So we spend a lot of dollars and funding and programs trying to fix those symptoms without really never going back, peeling the layers of the onion and dealing with the cause. And so what we have done is with the bacteria, we have masked the symptoms and temporarily put Band-Aids on symptoms by giving the bacteria what I would say like a Motrin or a Tylenol or an ibuprofen. And we know that only masks symptoms for a little while, then those symptoms come back. If you really want to shift culture and climate and bring healing into learning centers, then we must give bacteria antibiotic. If we treat the bacteria properly with the antibiotic, all of those symptoms clusters begins to improve on their own. So again, we're talking about school community, not just the students. We need to understand that trauma is impacting the brain, period. You're human. And when we have different reasons the brain has been impacted, you're just not going to perform better. Okay. So we know that trauma looks like different things. Many of our kids are going through child abuse, plethoras of abuse, from verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual, from neglect to poverty. Poverty opens the door to homelessness. Homelessness opens the door to hunger and starvation. Yes, it's going to be difficult for kids to pay attention to algebra and excel well in calculus and trigonometry and language arts when they have not eaten in 3 days. If your brain is in hyperarousal state because you are concerned about your safety and the limbic systems of the brain has taken over, then you having cognition on your prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe of your brain, you're not going to have high academics. Mass incarceration is huge. It's very traumatic. It creates separation of families. We know a lot of fathers, especially fathers of color, are incarcerated. But then we also see a major rise in women being incarcerated in state and federal prisons. Grief and loss have been a major issue. It's a major issue now because of COVID, but pre-COVID, most definitely, we had a lot of grief and loss. We had children going through, caregivers and parents and loved ones going through, have died or passed away, or divorce. We have a lot of children that grieve over that. Okay, so this has been a big issue. Foster care, removal of children from their home. In the Latinx community, Hispanic community, border issues are still an issue. Detainees being in the detention center because of the different levels of trauma is real, and it creates separation of families. They used to say when I was a kid, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I come to tell you that's a bone-faced lie. I can tell you right now, words are very hurtful. It's one thing to be physically bullied, but verbal bullying is very, very intrusive and creates a lot of harm. And I know adults that have been a bully 30 years ago, and the 8th grade are still triggered by some of the things that happened to them years ago. So bullying is more than just be kind. Bullying is very intrusive. It can be very dangerous to the mental and the emotional health of our students. 160,000 American students have anxiety to go to school because of bullying. We have different levels of bullying now. Now it's something called cyberbullying because of technology. We didn't have that in my age when I was coming up. But certainly cyberbullying is real, where people can be bullied and intimidated through social media, through Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. So we want to keep our minds, our eyes on dealing with bullying. And a lot of school districts have addressed bullying from discipline, but they don't have comprehensive of a robust bullying prevention program where students can come to adults and get help and get the support they need. So we need to make sure that when we look at trauma, Also know that bullying is a major piece. Bullying because of sexual orientation is a thing that's on the rise. Transgenders, race-based bullying, racial slurs and microaggression, intimidation because and being bullied because of race and skin color and ethnicity. This is all traumatizing to the brain, ladies and gentlemen. What are we doing with our traumatized teachers? Because we have a huge teacher shortage all over the nation because of STS, secondary traumatic stress. We see that teachers are leaving, transferring to school from school, or they're totally transferring out of the educational system altogether. So we need to be looking at how do we address teacher attrition and deal with also teacher retention. We also seeing because of high levels of trauma, chronic stress, which impacts behavior and classroom management, that our veteran teachers are being impacted by burnout and impacted by compassion fatigue, and they're leaving early, they're retiring early because of the high levels of trauma that we're seeing in our school system. So burnout is serious. And we do see our new teachers first 2 or 3 years are leaving the profession. And then now we have COVID. Now, everything I talked about was pre-COVID. So now imagine looking at now February 2020, the whole nation, our whole world, our whole institutions, our agencies, and our fabric of institutions that we depended on was all shut down and impacted by this thing called COVID-19. It had created a recession like we've never seen before. We've seen a lot of financial collapse. We said unemployment was on the rise. And then on top of that, we had racial tension get right back on the rise again. We've seen George Floyd be murdered, which triggered our nation and triggered our community. And we've always been saying that there has been racial issues and racism and discrimination going on with the communities of color. And so on top of all of those things, when students come back to school, they have all these things on their mind. They have all of this stress on their mind, all these things that has impacted them. And yes, racism do create racial trauma. The brain, there's a neurobiological impact and response when you are a victim of racism, when you're a victim of hate crimes, when you have heard stories of your ancestors being lynched and the struggles and the danger of Jim Crow and black codes and redlining and segregation and racial profiling and overly incarcerated African Americans, Latinas, and Native Americans. Yes, that is very, very traumatizing. And ladies and gentlemen, we know that we have issues with law enforcement when it comes to communities of color, but more importantly, most people of color have experienced racism from the educational system. And so we must make sure that when we're talking about trauma, that there are elements that is also race-based. So that brings me to my next point of talking about then how has trauma impacted us? I firmly believe that trauma is a new public health crisis in our education. And if we don't catch it, and if we don't address it, and if we don't address how it impacts students, how it impacts our teachers, how it impacts our counselors, our social workers, our school psychologists, our classified and certified staff, our education systems are going to implode. And we're seeing some of that right now in behaviors. We're seeing that in classroom management. We're seeing that in low academics. And individuals who are working in these environments are not only dealing with a public health crisis, but an occupational hazard, which means that if you're working with people with high levels of trauma, if you don't take care of yourself, you will be impacted as well by the same traumas. So these are the different things that we experience. And so you need to know the signs. If you're feeling these type of signs of being worn out, impacted by secondary trauma, the number one, chronic exhaustion is a symptom. If you're tired all the time, you need three pitchers of coffee, not 3 cups of coffee, 3 pitchers of coffee and 5 Red Bulls just to get through the day, you may be impacted by compassion fatigue. What about reduced sympathy, feelings of anger, dreading work, just tired, don't even want to go to work? These are some of the signs that you're having difficulty to sleep, or some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue and grief and loss, and all of these different things that plays a major part in what we are going through. So I come to the point is, what is trauma? Dr. Hope, what is trauma? And I'm glad because I brought my brain with me. I hope you can see my brain that I brought with me. No matter what happens to this brain fire as different traumatic events, the brain can have neuroplasticity and reheal, rewire, and learn new habits. Thank God. So that means that whatever has happened to you does not necessarily determine your destiny. Maybe your history, but it's not your destiny. The million-dollar question, Dr. Hood, is what in the world is trauma? Trauma is the new buzzword. I'm hearing about trauma-informed, trauma-responsive. I'm hearing everybody talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress. So what in the world is a scientific answer of trauma? I'm glad you asked me because I'm going to tell you for free. Number one, trauma is what we were saying in the field of traumatology as a traumatologist. Trauma is a psychological, emotional injury or wound to the brain. And this happens when life-devastating or life-threatening things happens to a person. It totally just not impacts the brain, but ladies and gentlemen, it rewires the brain. So trauma is an injury, a injury or wound, psychologically injury or wound to the brain. When bad things happen, traumatic things happen, it impacts the brain, wires the brain. Secondly, trauma is also a stress that is so overwhelming that you have a difficult time coping with it. And so this is not routine stress like a traffic jam or routine stress like going to the airport and the security check line. It's just so stressful and so long. I get it. It's frustrating, but that's not trauma. Trauma is when you are just struggling and triggered. You're dysregulated by this overwhelming stress that's so overwhelming you have a difficult time coping with it. This is what we would call trauma. So trauma is an injury and trauma is an overwhelming stress. Let me give you a few types of trauma for your note taking so you can understand the types of trauma since we're talking about what is trauma. So I defined what trauma is. Let's talk about the different types. I can't cover them all because I don't have the time, but I'm going to give you about 5 important ones. Number one, acute trauma. Acute trauma is what I call a one-hit wonder. It only happened one time, but it gives you long-term ramifications. In other words, like if you was 7 years old, got in a bad car accident, and miraculously you survived the accident and you lived to tell the accident, but you're now 30 and 40 years old, but you still get triggered about what happened to you when you were 7 years old and relive those situations. That's what we would call acute trauma. It happened one time, but it have long-term effects too. Then there's another one called chronic trauma, which is a long-term type of trauma. I like to associate chronic trauma to like poverty because poverty is not something that you deal with for 2 days and 2 weeks. These are usually years, and sometimes it can be generational. Or abuse. By the time you find out that a caregiver or a parent or some stranger have abused a victim, it's been going on for a long while. That's what we would call chronic trauma. Thirdly, complex trauma. Complex trauma is what we would define as a person that is going through different plethoras of trauma at the same time. For example, you can have one person that is going through poverty. That same person has been abused by a caregiver. That same person is suffering from grief because the person that took care of them, the grandparent, has passed away, so they got grief and loss. And then CPS comes and remove them from the family and put them in foster care, and you got 4 different traumas in one person. That's called complex trauma. The next one, what I would consider, is historical trauma. Historical trauma is a trauma that is associated with minority groups. For example, in the Jewish community, the Holocaust is most definitely a traumatic experience to the Jewish community. Border issues and detainment is an issue in the Latinx and the Hispanic community. We also know with our Native American brothers and sisters that they were stripped of their land and stripped of their culture and language and their rich land that was full, really rich with that can grow great crops, was stripped from them and put them into wastelands. That still is a traumatic experience to our Native American brothers and sisters. And we most definitely note that chattel slavery in the 1600s has been devastating and extremely traumatic with the African American community. So that's what we will look at as historical trauma. Then the next one would be with generational trauma. And that's that vicious cycle that people are going through and experiencing traumatic experiences, but can't break those cycles. And so that trauma that great-granddaddy went through is now with granddaddy, and the granddaddy to daddy and daddy to son, and vice versa with daughters. It's a vicious cycle of traumatic events. So when we talk about different traumas, just think of this, because I don't have a lot of time. that trauma impacts different regions of the whole person. It impacts your cognition. If you look at the slide, it impacts your physical health, your emotions, your relationships. We know there's a big link with trauma and mental health, behavior, brain development, and cognition. The reason why we see a lot of things in our school systems is because of, and academics, is because when a person is in hyperarousal state and there's a release of that stimuli and cortisol, that the limbic system of the brain, the lower region of the brain, is in control to survive whatever they perceive to be a threat, and that compromises in the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. It impacts cognitive capacities and executive functioning. When we look at trauma, I want you to reimagine what that can look like. And so I show you a picture that trauma should be the foundation. All these other things should be major components that connects to trauma, as far as MTSS, as far as BBIS, restorative practices, social and emotional learning, equity, and bullying prevention. So what is going on when we talk about people that are going through hard times with chronic stress? It impacts the brain. If you notice on the right brain, there's a lot of underdevelopment because of abuse and maladaptive circumstances. But when you look on the left, you see this brain stimulated and lit up, right? Because that left brain is going to be high performing, there's high development, because there's a lot of love, there's a lot of support. So yes, when we talk about trauma in the brain, it certainly impacts that. When we talk about trauma, it impacts your memory. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about two: episodic memory and emotional memory, right? And so we know that this is the reason why people struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, because trauma just don't impact the brain. It has a big piece on that memory. It most definitely impacts the hippocampus piece of the brain by which individual struggles with, okay? So people get into this fight or flight. And this is what trauma is. And it's to help you survive life-threatening situations. And when you are in a fight or flight, and your brain perceives a threat, to survive that threat and fight or flight or freeze, other parts of the brain and parts of the body goes offline. Number one, you lose cognition. Number two, you lose a lot of the anterior cortex of the brain that helps regulate behavior. You lose immune systems. You lose digestive system, because you don't need to be digestive systems. You don't need your digestive system when you're trying to survive a life-threatening situation. So let me give you an example. Let's say you walk in a trail or jogging a trail, and next thing you know, you run into a brown bear. You know what your brain is going to do with that bear? It's going to perceive a threat, and your eyes are going to die, your pupils are going to dilate, your breathing is going to change, your blood is going to race, your muscles going to constrict, and at that point, you're probably going to be the strongest and fastest you ever have to survive that threat. Once the brown bear leaves your proximity, your body, your brain and body goes through this calming, right? But the question is what I want to throw to you: what happens when you live with brown bears every day? What happens when you go to school or go to work with brown bears every day? Your brain is constantly on high alert. And this is the reason why students struggle cognitively and academically, because you don't have a lot of cognition when the limbic brain is trying to survive a life-threatening situation. So we really don't have bad kids, ladies and gentlemen. We have kids that have been born and raised in bad situations and have been exposed to bad experiences. And as a result, sometimes they make bad choices. So what do we do to create healing? And I'm glad you asked me, because I want to close out on the positive, is that you can have resilience above trauma. Even during COVID, we can bounce back from COVID. Number one, relationships is the first R. According to Bruce Perry, one of our leading professors in psychiatry, he said the key to it is the power of love. When a child has love in the room, they have a fighting chance to survive their situation. The second R would be regulation. A dysregulated teacher can't help a dysregulated kid. I'm sorry. Dysregulated principal cannot lead a dysregulated staff. Somebody has to be regulated in the room, ladies and gentlemen. And so we have to do what it takes to address trauma. This is why I said school community, not just the students and the parents, but what about our traumatized teachers and staff? Well, how do we reimagine PD for our staff? It has to be more than practices and data. We have to support our teachers and staff socially and emotionally just as well as we do students. And the best way we do that is having regulation. Another thing I want to throw about regulation and relaxation is that we should have a relaxing room, somewhere where students can go to when they're acting out or they're having a terrible time, and they might need to leave the classroom session because they're too disruptive for a moment. Don't just send all the kids to the dean of students to be expelled and suspended, creating disparities and creating disproportionate numbers with kids, especially kids of color and poor kids. Put them in a calming room where they can get regulated and relax for about 15, 20 minutes, sometimes even 30 minutes, and then allow them to re-enter the classroom setting for instruction. Why do I say this? I say this is because if the more we keep kids behind books, the less we have to put them behind bars. If we don't educate kids, kids will be incarcerated. So we want to reverse the school to prison pipeline epidemic. We shouldn't be arresting kids from the schoolhouse and incarcerating them in the jailhouse, and they're getting felonies before they're 18, and that's impacting their outcomes. No. Let's get more proactive and say, wait a minute, let's understand trauma. Let's understand the things that they're going through, and let's help them achieve and rise above and have resilience above their trauma, which leads me to restorative practices, restorative justice. A lot of our discipline, that 3 strikes you're out, or 0 tolerance about discipline. That stuff doesn't work, ladies and gentlemen. It hasn't worked in years, and is not working now. It is time for us to shift from being harsh on discipline and now be smart on discipline. And this is what restorative approaches does. It gives that student that made a bad choice a remedy to come back into the population by addressing the harm that they made, making an apology letter, and rebuilding that relationship. The more we keep kids behind books, the less we have to keep them behind bars. Listen, resources is the key. Wraparound services, helping our people with trauma, our students as well as our staff. This is crucial, ladies and gentlemen. So I close out with resilience, and I close out with reimagining self-care. Make sure you take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you will not be good for anything else. So please make sure that it has to make sure that you're okay. So please take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you're no good for others. This is what I want to do, and I'm closing out for real. There's a difference between self-care and self-soothing. So you do need to do something for yourself, but it needs to be really self-care, not self-soothing. Self-soothing is what I do that makes me, self-soothing is what feels good to me, and self-care is what's good for me. For example, some people say, well, I want to do something for myself, but then when they do it, it has temporary pleasure, but it has long-term ramifications. For example, you say, hey, I need to do something myself. I want to treat myself, but you're type 2 diabetic, and you go to the Cheesecake Factory and order a whole cheesecake and you eat it all by yourself. That's really not self-care. That's more self-soothing. Oh, it feels good. It tastes good for right now, but your blood pressure is going to rise. You're going to feel it later. So I think you understand what I mean by making sure that when you do something good for yourself, make sure it's not self-soothing, but let it be self-care. All right. And so I leave this 8 dimensions of wellness for your thought. What do your self-care look like? There's 8 dimensions of wellness, not just one. What does your physical? What does your occupational? What does your spiritual, your financial? What does all this look like for you? Listen, I'm closing. I'm out of here. Thank you for your time, but take care of yourself. You can rise above your trauma. It may be your history, but it's certainly not your destiny. God bless and take care.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt. We really appreciate you, and I know we have to rush off. And thank you again for this session. I'll to let everybody know that we have your longer session and on here so they can review it. Thank you again. We appreciate it. As you can see on the comments, everybody's really excited about this presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
My gosh, I don't know what to say. I'm going to take that last one as not a, I'm just going to say ouch and move on. When you said self-care versus self-soothing, I'm like, man, I'm going to have to reevaluate some of my life.
Yeah, some of us are a little attacked there.
That's why I say I'm not gonna say it was attack. I wasn't attack. I was under attack. I'm just gonna say I resemble some of those remarks. Yeah, that was, man, Dr. Holt, you have definitely got us awake this morning. And Nyla Bell would like your information. If you, okay. I can share your, isn't it Demond at Demond Holt?
Yeah, Demond at demondholt.com.
Shared.
Yeah, so awesome, please get a hold to me. Thank you so kindly. Thank you for having me. I got to get on the airport, so I had to do it. I had to take care of you.
You're not going to blame me for that one. So we'll see.
We'll see you.
We'll see you soon.
Take care. Right, take care. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So again, okay, so let me answer a couple questions. Yes, Angela Valenzuela, yes, it was recorded. All of our sessions are being recorded. It will be available. All of the handouts and recordings will be on this website. You will return to this website and you'll be able to access, you can access all the handouts that are up already. All the handouts are already up. And then once all the recordings are converted, remember we have about 34 individual webinar sessions. Once they're all converted, there will be live links and we will alert you as to when you can access those. Thank you guys for I love in the chat, all of the conversation that was going on. Demond could definitely talk forever. Dr. Holt he's one of a kind. He talks about, adult adverse childhood experiences. He talks about trauma responsive communities. There's just so much. And if you knew him, he's off, right? If you knew him, he's about my height. I'm like 5'2". He's this little package, but boy, does he pack a punch.
We really love the fact that he talks that it's your history is not your destiny, because too often some of the discussions and discourse around trauma can be very deficit based around our kids, as if we have to, as if it's yet another thing to fix, and that's why they can't do anything right, and it doesn't become something actionable in a positive way. And he definitely has a much more asset-based view of how we are to respond to this. So we really appreciate and love that, because he completely aligns with all of our vision about this, since we believe that equity cannot exist without an asset-based practices and philosophies.
Absolutely. One of the things that he said, and he repeated himself today, but when he says trauma can be your history, but does not have to be your destiny, as you said, the part after that where he says, if you do not heal from your trauma, you will bleed over people who did not cut you. And again, I resemble that remark. I try to respond, from the moment and not from my history, but it's really difficult. Like we walk in our lived experiences. And so that's at IDRA, when we do training around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we talk first about ourselves and reflect on our own identities and how you take identity to intersectionality, where we understand that we have these different lived experiences, where we situate ourselves within different communities that we identify with. And then though the power comes in when we're able to understand that we have these multiple identities and move into a space called multiplicative praxis that talks about how we mindfully and intentionally take the energy and power and experiences from those multiple identities and put them to work for good. Basically being mindful that, like for me as a woman in STEM, that I take those experiences that were somewhere adverse, but to take those experiences and understanding that every day I walk, even though I'm now this director of an equity assistance center, I am always a math educator. I'm always a mom. I'm always a Black woman. I take all of that and I use it through multiplicative praxis to benefit other people in those situations. And that is where you reclaim some of that power. I'm talking about reopen, reconnect, and reclaim. So Dr. Holt, you have access. I've joined and added the handout to the chat. I'm sorry, he gets me so excited. I've added his presentation to the chat box, not the chat, the handouts. So you have access to that, and please he's amazing. So go ahead, Hector.
I would mention that throughout the day, you'll see a lot more information about the some of the intersectionality here that we're talking about. We have sessions around LGBTQ resources, obviously coming from from lots of different places, and centered not just around the LGBTQ situations, but also around the Latina African American situation and how that intersects. We have resources there. We have the Mexican American history and how to recenter our discussions with ethnic courses. We have just tremendous speakers the rest of the day. So please stay tuned. At the end of the day, Dr. Johnson will make some closing remarks. Make sure you stay tuned for those. And there will be an evaluation for you to evaluate anything that you didn't get a chance to evaluate yesterday and the 2 sessions. And we will obviously send out more information. And Dr. Johnson, I know you're going to introduce some of our videos of our friend Dr. Gorski, who is also a great ally when it comes to acid-based practices. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Borges. We have 2 more videos from Dr. Gorski, and then this afternoon we'll hear his final words. And so let me play the videos. Here's part 2, and we'll load part 3 momentarily. Here we go.
All right, welcome back, everybody. In this section of my session, I'm going to be focused on shifting from intercultural skills to what we talk about as equity abilities. And in a way, this is not really worded well. I'm not talking about shifting from, I'm really talking about building upon intercultural skills with what we call the 5 abilities of equity literacy. Again, this is to make sure that we're approaching this with equity and justice at the center of the conversation. So I think it's important to start by just identifying some important intercultural skills. And I would consider all of these to be important intercultural skills that are contributive to questions of equity and justice, if not necessarily a threat in and of themselves to inequity and injustice. But for instance, understanding our own cultures. I think that was a big piece of that cultural proficiency model, where they said, yeah, cultural competence is okay, but we also need this aspect where we're deeply understanding our own cultures and our own positionality, how that influences our lenses and that sort of thing. Communicating effectively interculturally, again, that's important. I think the concern about the intercultural communication thing is that often questions of power and privilege and oppression are sort of pulled out of that and not taken into account. But still, I would say as a cultural skill, it's an important skill. And you can see the other examples here. What I would like to challenge us to do is to think about what we call the 5 abilities of equity literacy. What are the knowledge and skills? What are the abilities we need in order to construct and sustain actively anti-racist schools or organizations, actively anti-heterosexist or transphobic or ableist or whatever the case may be? So before I jump into that, I'm going to just talk about it because I've been using the word equity and I haven't really defined it yet. But I think of equity both as sort of a movement or a commitment to movement or action, and also a way of being. As a commitment to action, I think of it as the process of redistributing access and opportunity to be fair and just within an institution. Well, how do we do that? We do that by eliminating racism and heterosexism. We do that by crafting actively anti-racist, actively anti-heterosexist institutions. Right? And again, I would say most models of interculturalism just don't get us there. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means it doesn't get us there. So again, we have to make sure that we're not embracing interculturalism because it feels a little easier. It feels a little less intense. It feels a little less political to focus on culture instead of focusing on anti-racism and those sorts of things. You can also think of equity as a way of being. the state of being free of racism, the state of being free of sexism or heterosexism or ableism. Now, this is sort of the more aspirational way of thinking about equity. I don't know if it's possible for an institution that sits in a racist society to be completely free of the impact of racism, but it's something that we should always be sort of working towards. So we should ask ourselves, whatever we're doing in the name of diversity, whatever we're doing in the name of intercultural, multicultural, cross-cultural, whatever we're doing in the name of inclusion or equity or justice, what we should be asking ourselves is, to what extent does this get us closer to being free of racism as an institution? Of course, we can't become free of racism by sort of tiptoeing around direct conversations about racism, because it's easier to talk about cultural diversity and those sorts of things. And in this sense, we have what I think of as sort of 3 tiers of equity action. And I think, no matter what we're calling what we're doing, I don't think it's as important what we call it as what we're actually doing. But whatever we call it, diversity, equity, inclusion, intercultural, whatever we're calling it, we should ask ourselves, everything we do in the name of that, is it doing one or more of these 3 things? And if it isn't, then we have to say, well, that's a very privileged approach to it. And to me, those 3 tiers are: 1 is identifying inequity, identifying and naming all the ways racism operates, all the ways sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, Islamophobia, all the ways these things operate. Honestly naming them, calling them what they are. The second is eliminating inequity, injustice, eliminating racism, because just naming it doesn't eliminate it, but we can't eliminate it if we haven't named it, right? So what are we doing to actually eliminate it? Not to let the racism survive, but help people cope with the racism, not to let institutional racism survive and then help people of different racial groups communicate more effectively with each other despite the racism, but eliminate the racism. And then actively cultivating equity. Actively cultivating. So we're not waiting for something to come up. We're actively cultivating it. We're actively examining policies and practices. And then it's important to remember with this that culture is one important aspect of identity around which inequity occurs. But it's not the only aspect of inequity. And we have to be careful not to conflate culture with race, culture with sexual orientation, culture with socioeconomic status. We have to be very careful about that, because again, although those things might have some cultural aspects to them, in the end, those are not cultural issues. Those are oppression issues that have to be addressed with anti-oppression initiatives, not cultural awareness initiatives or multicultural initiatives. So we think about the 5 abilities of equity literacy, and these are the 5 abilities. I'm going to talk about each one very quickly because I went over time in my last section, so I got to make this one a little shorter. The first one is, do I recognize even the subtlest bias and inequity in my sphere of influence? If you work in a school, do you recognize subtle ways ableism is operating around you? Would you recognize
Give me 1 second to move over.
All right, now we're on to part 3 of my session, and I'm naming this part Avoiding Common Racial Equity Detours. Now, we could talk about equity detours more broadly around other forms of equity, but just as a way to sort of focus a little bit, I'm going to be focusing specifically on racial equity as I talk about these things. Now, as I jump into this, one thing that I love seeing in organizations is sort of development and evolution in the way that they're doing their work and thinking about these things. And it's been a real joy over the years to follow some organizations, including IDRA, by the way, and the way that it's evolved to talk more sort of directly about issues of racism and that sort of thing. Other organizations have done that as well. So, as I talk through this next section, one of the things I want to mention is, again, remember what I'm focusing on here overall. I'm focusing on how those of us who are, as organizations or individuals, who are starting with the commitment to equity and justice, how those of us who are starting with that commitment can make sure that we maximize the transformative potential of the efforts that we're putting into that commitment. Okay, so I want to make sure, because I think sometimes when I'm doing, especially this section, I'm naming things that people are doing and believe a lot in and that sort of thing. And this is, the idea here is not to criticize anything anybody's doing. It's really just a challenge for all of us, including me, to make sure that we're maximizing our transformative potential. One of the ways we could do that is by avoiding what we call equity detours. So what do I mean by equity detours? Mostly what I'm referring to are things that schools and other organizations do in the name of, maybe in the name of equity, that sort of detour around a direct confrontation with inequity and injustice. So things that might create the optics of equity progress without actually creating equity progress. Okay, so what I want to do is talk through some examples of that. This is, in a way, sort of the negative critical framing. The next section, then we'll take a break. Then the next section is sort of the more positive framing, which is, okay, how do we avoid the detours? What are some basic principles that could guide our equity and justice work? So the first detour I call the pacing for privilege detour. This is when we pace our equity work in a way that prioritizes the comfort and interests of white people over progress toward racial equity. At whose pace are we moving? If we're doing equity right, then institutionally we should be moving at the pace of the people who are most desperate for us to move. We should be moving at the pace of the people who are pushing the hardest. But what happens in a lot of schools and other organizations that I work with is that the progress moves at the pace of the people who are least interested in the progress. That's the pacing for privilege detour. This notion we need everybody on board. There's never going to be a time when everybody's on board. There's never going to be a time. So the institution has to move at the pace of the people who are most desperate for the anti-racism, not at the pace of the people who are most skittish about talking about race. I'll often talk about this, and I'll have a school leader or a nonprofit leader or someone say to me, I understand that philosophically, but I just don't think we're ready for that. And even saying that is an example of pacing for privilege. The fact that I'm not ready for it is the evidence that I need it. Another bit of evidence I see for this, and probably my two least favorite words in the context of doing equity and justice work, is baby steps. I mean, what a privileged and entitled framework. Baby steps. I mean, against a rising tide of racism, baby steps in essence means we're moving backwards instead of forward. At some point, we need to make the steps that the people experiencing the racism need us to make. And then we can build bridges for individual people who are struggling to get there. But institutionally, we can't move at the pace of the people who are struggling to get there. Okay. So that's the pacing for privilege detour. The next detour, and this is kind of the detour that inspired this whole session, is what's called the deficit ideology detour. The deficit ideology detour is focusing on adjusting the cultures, mindsets, values, emotions, grittiness, attitudes, behaviors of students who are marginalized. If any of our equity, diversity, inclusion, I don't care what we're calling it, if any of those efforts go into adjusting something about people who are marginalized, then that's the opposite of equity and justice. Equity and justice are about eliminating the conditions that do the marginalizing, not adjusting people who are marginalized. So we can look at our equity efforts. Are any of them about, that's not to say that it's not important to have conversations about things like resilience and all that sort of thing. But a lot of these things are just filtered through this deficit view that suggests if we want to eliminate outcome disparities, we do that by fixing the people experiencing the disparities rather than by eliminating the conditions that result in the disparities. Grit, growth mindset, these sorts of things. Okay. Celebrating diversity detour. Mistaking celebrations of diversity for progress toward equity. I'm all about celebrating diversity. I think that's great. And I really don't think that has much to do with equity and justice. And it goes back to that story I shared at the very beginning where you have the students saying there's racism here, no one's doing anything about it. And you have the principal saying, you know, we really need more international food nights. So I don't think we should not celebrate diversity, but I think that stuff, the celebrating diversity stuff, that should be a separate ball of stuff from equity and justice. You know, a lot of school districts will hire someone to come in and be the equity person, and then they'll make that person responsible for all the cultural celebrations. And it's like, you can use someone else to run the cultural celebrations. The equity person should be focused on identifying inequity, eliminating inequity, actively cultivating equity. There's nothing about an international food fair that does any of those things, or a multicultural arts and crafts fair that does any of those things. Right? So I'm not saying we shouldn't celebrate diversity. I'm just saying we have to understand that's on a separate plane from equity and justice. The next detour is what we call the shiny new thing detour. This is counting on popular programs and initiatives that were never created with racial equity in mind to do the anti-racism work. Maybe that's grit. Maybe that's growth mindset. Maybe that's social emotional learning. Maybe that's trauma-informed practices. Maybe even restorative practices. I've seen schools implement those in anti-racist ways, but most schools that implement them do not implement them in anti-racist ways. So we can't count on them to do the work for us. You know, if we start with racism and we do some cool cultural diversity program, maybe add a little anti-bullying, a Kindness Matters initiative. We initiate SEL, PBIS, and restorative practices. We train everyone in grit and growth mindset. We still are going to land on racism because nothing on that list is a threat to the existence of racism. Kindness matters. It's like, yeah, of course kindness matters. But justice matters more than kindness. So if I have to choose between the two, I got to choose justice. And what kind of kindness what kind of twisted version of kindness doesn't have justice at its heart anyway? But again, I think a lot of schools adopt things like kindness matters because it feels like a soft landing spot that kind of creates the illusion of diversity and inclusion. Okay. The next detour is called the Poverty of Culture Detour. This language comes from Gloria Latson-Billings in her article, which is, it's not the culture of poverty, it's the poverty of culture. And if you haven't read that, I suggest that you read that. But focusing on vague notions of culture as a way around confronting racism. And I think, again, a lot of the cultural competence, cultural proficiency things do that. There was this one study I read that looked at medical education programs that use cultural competence as their primary diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And what it found was it identified 34, I think it was 34 programs across the country, across the United States. And what they found was only 2 of them even mentioned anything about racism. So 32 out of the 34, the entire diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy was built on a framework that looked like it was chosen to avoid conversations about racism. I talked about the cultural fetish already. I mean, here's just an example of this. Moyer and Clymer are school administrators who have written about cultural proficiency, and on the one hand, they name the issue of racism in schools, but the solution, look at the solutions they offer. I think that's a great example of what happens when we adopt sort of this culture fetish instead of really focusing on equity and justice. And then finally, the individualizing detour. When we focus exclusively on individual biases and actions and ignore institutional conditions. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great developments in IDRA over the years, that I've known about the organization is sort of doing more and more of that focus, more and more of the institutional, the structural. I think that's been fantastic to watch. Just a quick note on how to use the detours. I challenge you to develop a habit of naming the detours as they happen. So you're in a conversation about, supposed to be about equity in a school, and someone says, oh, well, those kids, if they just cared more about, then he's, okay, you could pause and say, did we just take that deficit ideology detour? That sounded like the deficit ideology detour. If you make a habit out of naming the detours as they happen, you'll start realizing how often they happen. So how easy it is to go off track of our central goal, which is identifying, in this case, racism, eliminating racism, actively cultivating anti-racism. So we use the naming to stay focused. The equity principles will help. That's where I'm going to go in the next section. So I'm going to end this section here and start again with talking about sort of the positive spin on these detours, which is some basic equity principles.
Wow. All I can say is wow. All I know is that you are definitely awake today. After Dr. Holt and now after Dr. Gorski, there is just so much going on in my mind right now. I love the comments that are being made in the chat. And I'm thankful that this is that this conversation can be had. When we think about all of our experiences coming from different perspectives, it's really important for us to keep in mind or to keep an empathetic heart and empathetic ear, and to be able to hear others' experiences that may be very different from our own. And that's within our own communities, as far as our racial communities or even gendered communities. But to be able to view others' perspectives and accept that it may be different from yours. So it's not an argument. Their lived experience is what it is. And so a couple things about moving into this next section of the day. When we go back to school, it's important for us to have this equity mindset. IDRA has a very a value added perspective of students and families and community members at large that everyone brings to the schoolhouse, right, to the campus. So we have to think about the fact that all of the different pedagogies, if you caught Dr. Stacy Johnson yesterday, she was talking about demystifying these pedagogies and theories, and it's time to put them into practice. The major focus of us returning to school, and Chrissy said it best, instruction disruption rather than learning loss. I have 2 students in school, at the time 6th grade and 8th grade, brand new middle schooler and an exiting middle schooler. The learning was not lost, it was never taught. So it was an interruption of instruction, or disruption, as Christy called it. And that's what we have to remember. So yes, we are playing catch up. We are accelerating learning so that we're not holding students back. But it's an opportunity. Everything that we are walking into this year, I see as an opportunity to do better than we were doing before. But I'm not going to get started because I will not, it'll take all day. But I do want to allow us some time to address some questions that we wanted to ask you, because if our goal is to reopen, reconnect, and reclaim our school communities, we have to do everything in our power to establish these cultures of care, communities of care that provide equitable and inclusive teaching and learning, designed with the whole student in mind. But again, as Dr. Holt mentioned, we have to also consider our teachers, our staff, our parents and families, and the community that have been affected by COVID. We are all returning to campuses with severe loss that can't be imagined. The last year and a half almost has disrupted our lives in ways that we cannot always articulate. And so we have to be sure that we are coming at this from a responsive perspective, right? So we had some questions for you guys, and you can respond in the chat. And as I said, I pinned the post. We will be able to collect the chat. And I spoke with Dr. Gorski yesterday and just let him know that the first day was amazing and that people were really responsive to his statements. And again, I resemble some of those remarks. 27 years in education, I wish I could apologize to some of my former students and parents and teachers under my charge. But right now, as we're moving into, some of you have begun this school year, moving into this new school year, we want to ask a few questions. So one, we'd like you to, and I'm going to drop these in the chat box. You can respond to all or one of these in the chat. But how are you formulating thoughts around your most immediate equity concerns? Now, like right now, as school is starting, and then over the next couple years, what have been some of your huge takeaways so far in the convening in the time that we've been together? What are you most excited about for the 21-22 school year? And then how will you reclaim education for your school community? And so we'd like to, again, give you a moment to respond to some of these in the chat. But really, just so far in our morning, and thinking of yesterday, if you were with us yesterday, what are some thoughts you are having around equity? We are an IDRA EAC-South is an equity assistance center. And if you are in our region, I know that 26 of your states are not, but 12 of the states represented here are in the US South, that is Region 2. And we are available for technical assistance and professional development, coaching and mentoring around issues of equity. And so we're wanting to know, what are some of the areas of concern that your school community has discussed as we move into this new year? And Chris Green asks, is there any possibility we might be able to be given a list of participant names, affiliations, and emails or other contact information? I have to ask that question. I know that we have the list. I do not know if we are available to share that information. I will have to find out if we have in the registration section whether or not there is a question about sharing information. We normally do not do that. And so I'm really hoping that I will get a few responses before we have to move on to our next section. So Deborah Long says that would be great. I will see if that is possible. Thank you, Mr. Dejan. As a teacher, being ready for probable impending legislation, wow, that may interpret my teachings as violating their critical race theory concerns. That, unfortunately, that should not be something that we are worried about moving into this school year. But I understand, I live in Texas, and so I know that is an actual concern for those of us here. Believe me, as an Equity Assistance Center, we've been in touch with the Department of Education about the work that we do, being that that's our charge. Christopher Watkins says providing instructional interventionists and additional professional learning opportunities for staff with direct PL professional learning on equity, diversity, and culturally responsive instructional practices. Mr. Watkins, if you are in the EAC-South region, that is something that we do. That's something that all the EACs do, where we are definitely adept at those conversations. And it's a facilitation that requires, a kind hand, but it definitely does impact our work, being able to do that. Nyla Bell says, as an equity TA provider in the Northwest, one of our biggest challenges is figuring out how to support school districts dealing with aggressive and organized opposition to CRT. So Nyla, I actually know Ms. Bell. Thank you for joining us, Nyla. Yes, this has been something that, even on school websites, people are challenging the teaching of CRT to our students. And again, there's a lot of misinformation around CRT, and that's something that all of us together need to, we're working on a solution of addressing, but it's not something that's going to stop us. So I go back to Mr. Dejan, that we just have to be prepared about how we will respond to feedback and pushback. And Ms. Green, thank you again. I can see if Mr. Bojorquez can add that to the evaluation, the final evaluation, we can add that link. Thank you very much for that suggestion. And Jared Fields says, I'm thinking most about beginning the year with a deep reflection and how are you doing and how you are doing to my students. Yes, I think that all of our students are going to need, and our teachers and our parents, everyone's going to need that time to really think about how to decompress and how to move forward together. There's a huge together in that. Middle Georgia is our state, Mr. Watkins. So we can definitely talk in the future. Again, I will drop my information in the chat. I saw another moment. Let's see. Everything of the convening has been great. The keynote speakers. Oh, Dr. Aviles, thank you. Ms. Cantu, Dr. Gorski, Dr. Khalifa, the gallery walk. Concern on how schools will address the social and emotional well-being of staff, families, and students. And I'm so thankful that she mentions all three. Again, this is really something, I'm sorry, I'm reading, but I cannot express enough, and I have over the last several months since March 16th, when we left our offices to begin working remotely, that we were doing so much thinking and responsive technical assistance around how to support the students that we kept asking, what are we doing for the teachers? Like, how are they doing? Because to go from your regular normal, whatever normal is for you, day to, oh my gosh, now we have to do all of this remotely, and what are we doing, and all of this. I just kept thinking, what about the teachers? As a teacher, I kept thinking, I haven't been in the classroom in 11 years, not in a public school, secondary school, in 11 years. As a teacher, this has to be madness. And so trying to find ways to support them and providing all the strategies that we could, but also, again, even if your campus doesn't consider itself restorative practices in the first tier of building community is crucial. It is a critical part of the way we are moving back into schools, or how we left school and how we're moving back into school, and all the time in between. So it's just really important for us to consider how we cultivate these centers of care, communities of care, where everyone is not only invited, but welcomed, feels included, that we've heard from everyone. And it's going to be really necessary for us to do that. I have 7 minutes. Can more information be shared with this group on how we can move forward with teaching students real history and not change the narrative? That is a grave concern. Okay, so this afternoon there are 2 additional sessions in the ethnic studies strand that will help address that. In fact, Dr. Liliana Saldana, let me slow down, y'all get me excited. Liliana Saldana will be speaking about that very topic, about how to move into more of the content areas and not just in ethnic studies courses. There are also, I saw someone mention community. Dr. Vonetta West will also be speaking twice. She is both in the strand of welcoming and inclusive schools, strand 3. She will be presenting on salvation versus community, and then also creating centers of honor for students. And she's going to blow you guys away too. You can't go wrong this afternoon or this morning. You cannot go wrong with any of the sessions that you find yourself in today. And we will also, again, you will have access to all of these recorded webinars and the handouts. I see a note here from Dr. Angela Valenzuela that says, I'm thinking of the contradiction of legislators who maintain that structural oppression either doesn't exist, oh boy, or is exaggerated because we're all individuals, quote unquote. However, they forget to notice how they themselves are structural when they demonize teachers as teaching kids incorrectly in schools. In short, they do believe in structural practices. And I'm going to respond personally with that. This is Paula. I know it says Dr. Johnson right there, but in this moment, I'm Paula. We tend to be supportive of structures in which benefit us. And that's all I can say. We have a latent support of anything that benefits us. I just believe that. And I'm not a scientist, so that's why I'm saying that was Paula. But, you know, when things benefit us, and I'm talking about anything. So something as big as CRT, where in Texas and federally, we celebrated Juneteenth, but had just passed something in Texas that basically doesn't want us to talk about anything that happened that led up to Juneteenth. That is a contradiction for me, and it's very difficult. But this is the world we're living in right now, and we will continue to fight. This fight is tiring as it is. There's also another presentation that we're going to be using, or that we had from Thomas Marshall. There's a team where they talk about curriculum whitewashing and classroom censorship rather than critical race theory. So there are a lot. There's so much. Please go into the agenda and check your schedule for the day. Thank you, Chris Green. Thank you all of you. It is, I just, on that note, on that last comment, I am so honored and proud to be directing the IDRA EAC-South. IDRA is unlike no other organization in the world for me, and I'm just proud to be a part of it. Dr. Deborah Long said, can more information be shared with this group about, our students deserve to learn the truth. That part right there, our students deserve to learn the truth. I just think it's really important that we talk about critical whitewashing as trauma-inducing, because it negates individuals' experiences. And so it's really important for us to, again, if I can't hear from someone else's perspective about how they are seeing the world, all of our students, I am trying to basically erase their existence. And so don't let as we refer to ourselves as the idritas, are about to chime in. So they know, as you all hopefully have gotten a glimmer of in the last several days, we are very passionate about this work. We consider it a calling, not just a vocation. And we live this. We all live this work in everything that we do. So I'm gonna end with making sure that I have mentioned once again. Please. I was just about, thank you, Clara Beltiru. Please share your thoughts on your social media channels with the hashtag Equity Gadfly. I didn't hear our president say it yesterday. A gadfly. IDRA has been called gladflies for years. Gladfly. Let me calm down. A gadfly is like a gnat that just continues to pester and pursue. And so they started calling us that, and we embraced it and took it to ourselves. And so you will see, like can you see my shirt? On my shirt, this is a gadfly, and that is one of our symbols. That reminds us that we are powerful in our pestering. So we will continue doing that. And I'm going to end with Dora Olivo says, we need to stop growing coconuts and Oreos, etc. Woo! And teach real history to all of our students. And on that, I'm going to end. I'm just going to ask you to join me back in the closing. Please go find the session that you'll attend at the 11 o'clock hour for CST time. And then again at 1:30, you'll have 2 breakout sessions. We also have gallery walks while you're eating your lunch, taking your bio breaks, and just stretching those legs during the noon to 1:20 time. You will have, thank you, Christy, always gives me the wonderful vernacular. The gadfly arouses others from complacency. I love that woman. We'll have breakout sessions today on LGBTQ resources, student advocacy. I will be doing another session on our technical assistance and just questions about the EAC-South and how to receive technical assistance services. We'll have another session from Michelle Vega on digital equity. And then Dr. Nolka Aviles will be talking about IDRA's Valued Youth Partnership. If you are looking for ways to engage students, that's the session for you during the gallery walk. I'll see you back here at 2:30. Enjoy your day. Gadflies unite. We'll see you later.